Kafka's Last Trial, my most recent book, is, in brief, the very unlikely story of how Kafka's manuscripts came into a family in Tel Aviv. It's a story that involved a then unrecognized Jewish writer in Prague who was endowed with genius, although his best friend, who was also a writer, was not, whose last wish was betrayed by this closest friend. It's the story, I would say, of a wrenching last-minute escape from Nazi-occupied Prague. It's escape of a story of arrival in Tel Aviv, and fundamentally, it's a story of how two countries which were obsessed with their own pasts and with their relationship to one another really came to a head in a trial in Israel's Supreme Court, which culminated in 2016. This trial determined where Kafka's long-lost manuscripts would reside, either in Germany, in the Marbach Literary Archive, or at the National Library here in Jerusalem, where I'm speaking with you today. And above all, the trial opened up another question, which is really an interpretive question, which is not just who owns Kafka's legacy, but what kind of a writer is Kafka? Is Kafka fundamentally a writer who belongs in the German literary modernist canon, because he wrote, of course, in German? Or is he fundamentally a Jewish, albeit diaspora writer, who happened to have written in his own kind of Prague German? So in that sense, this book is not so much about Kafka's life as much as it is about Kafka's afterlife, and how that afterlife implicated this figure in the story that Germany tells about itself and in the story that Israel tells about itself. And in writing the book, I came to realize that the judges here in Jerusalem, the Supreme Court judges, in a sense acted as sort of the interpreters of Kafka. That is to say, I read the verdicts, some of which run to 50 or 60 pages, not so much as legal texts, but as literary ones, as ones that put the judges in the positions of the last gatekeepers of, or the latest gatekeepers of Kafka interpretation. So that's the story I tell in this book. It's essentially a story that uses Kafka's manuscripts as a thread to connect the various generations and the various travails and travels of these figures from Prague to Tel Aviv and ultimately to the Supreme Court in Jerusalem. I had been following this case ever since I was a guest at Die Zeit newspaper in Hamburg in 2010. And I should add that this case began in 2008 in the family court in Tel Aviv, which is to say it was a simple case of a will, of a disputed will, in this case the will of Max Brod, Kafka's closest friend, who died in Tel Aviv in 1968. And in the case began in 2008, and I sort of followed it as it wended its way up from the family court to the district court and finally to the Supreme Court. I finally really decided to write the book when I actually sat in the Supreme Court chambers here. And I came to understand that what was going on was that the proceedings were taking place on two very different registers of language. On the one hand, they were legalistic in the technical sense, an interpretation of Max Brod's will. But just beneath the surface was a very interesting, different register of language, which was very ideological, which was very nationalistic, and which had, strictly speaking, very little to do with the legal technicalities. Just to give you an example, I'm sitting there that day, and the Israeli team of lawyers is raising arguments like, well, perhaps Germany is the last place that Kafka's legacy should reside. After all, they didn't take very good care of his three sisters, all of whom perished in the Shoah. And then the German side would say things like, well, you know, Kafka, of course, died in 1924, before there was a state of Israel. He never stepped foot in this place. He was not, unlike Max Brod, he was not by any means a Zionist. And therefore, what is the connection between Franz Kafka and Jerusalem? And then the Israelis would reply with their own ideological arguments, the implicit assumption of which, as I would paraphrase it, was that, well, actually, Kafka, although he is a diaspora writer, in fact, maybe even the paradigm of a diaspora writer, he belongs in Jerusalem simply because Jerusalem has seen itself as the center of gravity, as the culmination of a story that began elsewhere. Which is to say that unlike in the beginning years of the state, where there was a very ambivalent relationship to German language and German literature, these days, there is a different kind of way that Jerusalem has, and Israel in general has begun to see itself, which is to say the end or the culmination of a story that began in the diaspora. Therefore, Kafka somehow belongs in Jerusalem, which is the center of the ingathering of exiles, not just in the sense of ingathering of refugees and of people from the four corners of the world, but also ingathering of cultural and material legacy. Famously, Max Brod ignored Kafka's last request to burn all of his manuscripts unread. And I think that that was an act of both betrayal and of love. Since the death of his closest friend Kafka in 1924, Max Brod dedicated the energies of the rest of his life to giving us the Kafka that we know. I would say Max Brod, who was a writer in his own right, his best creation, you might say, is the creation of Kafka. He's the one who, in saving these manuscripts, saved them in multiple senses, right? He saved them on the one hand physically from Kafka's own instructions. He saved them from the Nazis when he fled with a suitcase stuffed full of Kafka's manuscripts in March of 1939 and found refuge in Tel Aviv. And he saved Kafka's reputation by publishing the 3 unfinished novels, by being the first biographer in 1937 of Kafka, by publishing not just his fiction, but also his diaries, also his famous letter to his father. So what we know of Kafka today, we owe to Max Brod in that sense. So it's a very complicated act. It's an act, of course, of betrayal. It's an act also of great love and devotion. I should say also that Max Brod, in all the years, both in Prague and in Tel Aviv, that he worked on these manuscripts and that he published Franz Kafka, he never took a penny of profit for any of this. I'll also just add that it's maybe a mark of Franz Kafka's genius that he put these instructions to the person who's least likely to fulfill them. I think in his heart of hearts, Franz Kafka knew that Max Brod would be incapable of fulfilling his last instructions. And precisely for that reason, he delivered these last instructions to Max Brod. Max Brod was the, in my opinion, greatest posthumous editor of the 20th century. He took Kafka's voluminous materials and he put them in publishable form. What does that mean? Zadie Smith, the writer, once said that we, of necessity, read Kafka broadly, which is to say, we read Kafka through Brod's editorial interventions. Brod invented titles for what Kafka left untitled. He put in sequences what Kafka had left unsequenced. He changed the language when he took out various sexual references from Kafka's diaries. Sometimes, as with Kafka's short story Descriptions of a Struggle, Max Brod would merge 2 manuscripts into one. So I think that this says something about Max Brod. He was, on the one hand, a savior, but he also manipulated whatever came into his hands. So just to take one step back, to answer that question, let's follow the manuscripts a bit. Max Brod stuffs them into a suitcase. He flees on the last possible day it's possible to flee Nazi-occupied Prague, and he arrives with this suitcase in Tel Aviv. He needs help in editing this voluminous material, so he hires as his secretary a woman named Esther Hoffe, who herself was a Prague refugee who had come to Tel Aviv. And they would meet twice a week, and they would edit these materials together, and they formed not just a professional relationship, but a quite intimate and close personal relationship as well. Max Brod dies in 1968 in Tel Aviv, and he, like Franz Kafka, was childless. So in his will, he gives all of his own estate, which includes all of the invaluable, priceless Kafka manuscripts, to Esther Hoffe. Now, in the subsequent decades, Esther Hoffe does something that she never dared to do during the lifetime of Max Brod. She begins to sell things. Most famously, in 1988, she goes to Sotheby's in London, and she puts up for auction the original manuscript of Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial. It goes for about $2 million, the highest ever paid for a modern literary manuscript. The buyer, through various schemes, was the Marbach Literature Archive in Germany, where I was able to see this manuscript myself in researching the book. Now, Esther herself sells off various other things that make it into various markets, and she dies herself at the age of 100 in Tel Aviv in 2007, and in turn gives all this material to her daughter, Eva Hoffe, who is mentioned in the question. And it's Eva who bears the burden of this trial in the Supreme Court here in Jerusalem. And essentially, Eva's position is that Max Brod was a sort of father figure for her, right? He helped raise her. He taught her music. And her intent was that, in court at least, was that this archive of Max Brod is her most valuable possession, is her most valuable inheritance. And she saw what Israel was trying to do as a kind of national appropriation of private property. And I have to say that I found her a very, very sympathetic character, which is to say, she would say things to me that could have come out of a Kafka novel, as if she were a Kafka character herself. So on that day at the Supreme Court, for example, she said to me, "Oh, I feel like this trial has been lost from the start. I feel like I am just a solitary woman who's up against these two vast, national powers, and yet, right? And yet I have to pursue this to the end." In the end, Eva lost her case, and she had to give up all of these manuscripts without any compensation to the National Library. And she was devastated, of course, by this. And she died about a year afterwards. And I saw this trial as basically her inheritance, right? In other words, paradoxically, ironically, among the many ironies of this case, she inherited her disinheritance. Well, among other interviews I conducted for this, besides Eva, let me say one more thing about Eva, which pertains to the previous question, if I can. I believe that you at the Book Week have had Nicole Krauss as well as a guest. And Nicole's last book, Forest Dark, as you probably know, in a sense continues this story by imagining that Kafka had, let's say, not died of tuberculosis in 1924, but had somehow managed to come to the promised land with his manuscripts. And that's actually, Nicole is part of a long, long tradition, starting with a novel by Max Brod himself in the 1920s, of imagining that Kafka had arrived in the Jewish state. And what would that have looked like? I once asked Eva, we were walking in the street near her home on Spinoza Street in Tel Aviv, which she shared, by the way, with about a dozen cats and Kafka's manuscripts. And I said, "Oh, have you heard about this new novel by Nicole Krauss? And this is what its premise is." And she had only a one-sentence reply. Eva said, "Ah, Kafka wouldn't have lasted a day here." So, but more to the point of your question, I also interviewed, of course, the director at the time of the Marbach Literature Archive, which is a world-class literature archive in Germany. And we came to speak about this question of why does it matter in today's digital age, where physical manuscripts of one writer or another might actually reside. After all, the National Library here in Jerusalem has pledged to digitize all of the material and put it online for public viewing. And this director, Dr. Ralph, said, well, in this case, actually, it does matter because it will determine the way Kafka might be read and interpreted, which is to say, now I'm paraphrasing him, if the material ends up in Jerusalem, Kafka will be read in the narrow sense as a Jewish writer. If, however, his legacy and his estate ends up here in Germany, it's not just that our facilities are better than the facilities in Jerusalem. It's not just that our expertise with German language literature is far superior. It's also that Kafka will be interpreted and read in the broadest, most universal sense. And I thought to myself, this is an amazing assumption that carried the German side during the trial. That assumption is that if anyone has interests, it's the Israelis. They have the narrow interests. We Germans, if we have interests at all, it's only the interests of, literature as such, or European humanism as such. And I thought to myself, that's just staggering, to hear just a historical blink of an eye after the Shoah, that somehow Israeli culture, Jewish culture, is perceived as the narrow, particularistic one, and German culture is perceived somehow as sort of the universal. So that's just one example of another interview that I conducted for this book. Since the trial concluded, the manuscripts are still coming in, they're still being cataloged, they're still being sorted, even as we speak. Because this is a Kafka story, appropriately enough, it's unfinished, which is to say that there were several different caches of manuscripts that all came in at different times after the trial. One was in Eva's apartment in Spinoza Street in Tel Aviv. Another was in a bank vault in Tel Aviv. A third was in and perhaps the most important, was in a Swiss bank vault. And there was a secondary trial to kind of liberate those manuscripts from Zurich and to bring them to Jerusalem. That's also happened. There was yet another cache, a fourth cache, that was discovered by the German Federal Police outside of Wiesbaden that apparently was being sold on the black market, and that they had found in a warehouse that was housing stolen and forged art. And there was a fourth process that determined that should also come to Jerusalem. And there was, so it's an unfinished story that's still unfolding as we speak. But yes, I've seen many fascinating things that have never been seen before. There's, for example, Kafka sketches that no one has seen before. There are postcards and correspondences. There are there's a lot of Hebrew material. It so happens that Kafka, as we mentioned before, was by no means a Zionist, but actually at the end of his life, he was intensely interested in studying Hebrew. So at the National Library today, if you have a chance, you the guests have a chance to come, you can see, for example, his Hebrew vocabulary notebooks. And I think we have I've sent you, Nicholas, a photograph of one of them, in which he is, they're not the notebooks of a beginner, they're actually quite interesting words. One page that I happen to open to, for example, has the word in Hebrew, gaon, which is the word for genius. He has the word tuberculosis, shachefet in Hebrew. So there's a lot of Hebrew material that's now being available. There's also a new letter that he wrote in a very fluent Hebrew to his Hebrew teacher, who was a 19-year-old student who came from Jerusalem to Prague. And the last line of that letter, translated, is he's apologizing for not doing his homework. And he says, "Please don't be angry at me. I'm angry enough for the both of us." There's also, besides the Kafka material, there's one of the great treasures of this newly available material is the multi-volume journal and diary that Max Brod kept from 1917 until his death, and that will shed new light on this remarkable friendship between Max Brod and Franz Kafka. And I'll just finish with one small anecdote. I came to know a very, very talented writer named Kathy Diamant in California, who wrote a book about Kafka's last lover. Her name was Dora Diamant. And actually, Kafka and Dora studied Hebrew together. She was from a Hasidic family. And Kathy calls me up and she says, I'm coming to Jerusalem and I would like to bring two of Dora Diamant's descendants who live outside of Tel Aviv. Can you arrange for us to see some of this material? So with the help of the expert German language archivist here in Jerusalem, Stefan Lied, he was able to show us passages from Max Brod's diary about their ancestor, Dora, that they had never seen before, and photographs of Dora that she had inscribed on the back that just blew their minds. And that's something that I think will happen now with increasing frequency. There are going to be some wonderful and fascinating revelations from this material that's now available in Jerusalem.